citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens. Same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome to another episode of the People-Powered Planet podcast, where each week we have extraordinary solutionaries helping us build what Garry called the people-powered planet. How do we envision and take back our power to create the world we choose? Today, we are going to have Mark Oettinger, who is an attorney, a seasoned attorney, an educator, an author with extensive experience in the judicial system and in the rule of law. And he's been working with the World Service Authority for many years. And now, of course, many of you know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed unanimously in 1948, declares that everyone on earth has rights and freedoms. But we see that they're often violated. How do we create a way to enforce those rights for the people of this planet? Before I go into talking with Mark, I want to give you a little background, because Mark is actually carrying on some very important work. Now, this is when Garry went to Lucknow, India, where every year there's a conference of Supreme Court justices from all over the world talking about exactly our subject. How do we create world law? How do we create law above the nations that divide us, so everyone on earth is actually protected in their rights and freedoms?
It's your world. You have the right to travel on it, but you have to be clever. You see, you can't just say, "Hey, this frontier is ridiculous. I saw a bird come into your, country, and are we less than a bird, for God's sake? What is this front?" No, you can't do that, because these people on the frontiers are kind of
trapped in stupid rules. So we simply play their document game.
I'm on my way. There are 5 checks.
Inviting the judges to sign up as world citizens and to be world Supreme Court judges. But you can't do it until we have a citizenry. The citizenry is us.
So you saw Garry traveling there. Hello, Barbara. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you there. We see David Gallup is on. Joseph, welcome. As you saw, Garry was traveling with his world passport. Now, it's very interesting because it's very arbitrary whether this passport that was issued by the World Service Authority in Washington, D.C. that Garry founded. And it's very, border guards, one border guard can reject it, another can accept it. At the very same conference that Garry attended, where you saw him speaking, another person coming to that conference with the world passport was rejected. And at another conference, Garry actually was sent back to the US, but somebody else who went to the conference got in on their world passport. So it's all very, very arbitrary. But the key question, welcome, Merle, glad to have you here on this. The key question that Garry said he called on these Supreme Court justices to become world Supreme Court justices. Well, after he did that, he figured, well, okay, there's a world Supreme Court, if there'd be world Supreme Court justices, we've got to begin to create a court of human rights for the world. That's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says. I mean, here of all the nations in the world said that everyone has rights and freedoms and laid them all out. Where's the court to administer that? And Garry always felt that every step he took, including creating this passport, was all mandated by that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because that declaration doesn't say that just governments are supposed to do that. It says every organ of society, every individual is required to enforce these rights. So Garry is just simply fulfilling the mandate of that when he did what you'll see here in this next scene. And this is in 2011.
On September 4th, 1953, from the City Hall of Ellsworth, Maine, I declared a government of, by, and for the people of the world. Today, on my 90th birthday, by this historic opera house where the United Nations was declared, I, Garry Davis, coordinator of the World Citizen Government, hereby declare de jure the World Court of Human Rights, tasked with the solemn duty of protecting the rights and freedoms of all human beings on the face of the earth. It shall be the mandate of this court to uphold legally our inalienable rights as codified by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declared unanimously by the United Nations in 1948. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's in your hands now.
You know, Garry had the audacity to think that we had the right to do what our founding fathers did. He explains very thoroughly that when the Continental Congress was held, they were tasked with just simply tinkering with the Continental Congress. But these men in that room decided that they wanted to, our founders decided that they were going to create a new government. They didn't apply for it. It wasn't an application for independence. They didn't say to England, oh, please let us be independent. Here's all the reasons we should be independent. They just simply went out and declared it. And what gives them the right to do that? Well, you know, the Declaration of Independence says that it is the right of the people to institute new government. Well, who do they mean when they say people? Just old guys in gray wigs, or you and I? Do all of us actually have a right to do this? So today we have someone following in Garry's footsteps who feels that we, the people, do have the right. We're the ones who create all these institutions around us. They all come out of the human mind, and they're all things that we invent. And we have the right to invent something new, and we have the requirement to do so if we're going to survive as a human race. We, the people, have to unleash the new superpower, which is the people of the world, who right now we're locked in these boxes called nation states, and those keep us weak, and the planet is plunging toward destruction. Once we begin to realize and take back our power, we do have the power to save our human rights, and the most basic human right of all, which is the right to have our species continue to have life on planet Earth. Now, Mark Oettinger is a seasoned attorney working to do that. He's worked for many years as an attorney in Vermont, even in the government of Vermont. And tell us first, Mark, how you first met Garry.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on this podcast. I first met Garry, I think it was in 2000. I got a call from a United States District Court judge, Judge Bill Sessions, who actually had done a lot of international travel with me in connection with rule of law activities in the former Soviet Union. And he said that we have a case here before the court in which an individual's aircraft is sought to be seized by the United States Attorney's Office here in the District of Vermont. And it's a fascinating case, and I would appreciate it if you would come over and represent his interests in this proceeding. And so I was intrigued, of course, and I immediately went over and met Garry. He had flown from Burlington, Vermont to Montreal, I think it was, somewhere in Canada, and had assisted in bringing into the United States, or attempting to bring back into the United States, a woman who had been living in the US illegally, you know, in the traditional current sense of that. She did not have immigration permission to be here in the United States. She had gone to Canada for medical treatment, and then when she tried to come back into the country, she'd been rejected. So Garry heard of this, he was offended by this, and he flew to Canada, picked her up and brought her back, and landed the airplane back in Burlington, Vermont, where they were promptly detained. Her for illegal entry and him for alien smuggling, essentially. And his aircraft was subjected to potential forfeiture, seizure, just like a car would be if you drove around trying to sell drugs in it, or a house if it's used as an operation for some type of fraud. The actual asset can be forfeited to the government. So the U.S. attorney did not charge Garry, did not charge the woman that he had transported in, but did initiate proceedings to forfeit the aircraft. And so it was in that civil context that I first got to know Garry. And he ended up deciding, as a matter of sort of public disobedience, if you will, to openly allow the aircraft to be seized, to sort of make a public point about the fact that he felt that the immigration laws of the United States were contrary to the rights of individuals, as he saw it under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to travel from country to country freely. And so it was an act of civil disobedience, and that's how we met.
And, you know, Garry maintains in his article about it that she was actually born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and but had been a rape victim, and anyway, there were complications to why she couldn't prove that. And so but he felt she is a U.S. citizen who was denied entry, and of course had lived there, running a homeless shelter in New York and helping people, and then got banned because she went to go get Bibles. So anyway, interesting story, but that does bring us around to the key question that we're here for, is Garry's declaration of a World Court of Human Rights. Tell us a little bit more about how you first heard about that from Garry, and then about your experience in actually going later to meet with those with the Supreme Court justices from around the world who gather each year in Lucknow, India.
So, having met Garry in 2000, we became friendly because, you know, I'm an international lawyer. My passion is public and private international law. I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of public international law, treaties, conventions, things like that. So he was one of the few people in the area that knew something about this area, and we gravitated toward each other. And so we saw each other socially. He lived in South Burlington. I lived in Burlington, literally a 5-minute drive from each other. And, you know, we got to talking about the work that he had done ever since the Ellsworth Declaration in 1953, and, you know, going back even further to the Second World War, when he renounced his US citizenship in 1948 in Paris in front of the United Nations, disrupted their proceedings right before they voted on the Universal Declaration. And so, you know, conversation turned to things like world government. He was much more optimistic about the rate at which that might be accomplished than I was. I was fond of telling him that I don't think that that's a feasible outcome during my lifetime. But he also talked about a world court, and he talked more specifically about a world court of human rights. I am a judicial systems person, and I thought that the idea of trying to fulfill the long-term plan that has come up periodically since 1947 to create a world court of human rights, to adjudicate public, you know, factual fact patterns in front of a body that could then determine what the nation state obligations were under existing human rights law. I've always thought that that was an important goal, and something that might be attainable during my lifetime. I mean, I should point out that above the nation state level, there are what we call supranational courts, of which notably there's the International Court of Justice, there's the International Criminal Court, and in my vision, the World Court of Human Rights would be the third leg of that stool. It would essentially adjudicate cases which would be vetted by the court, similarly to how the US Supreme Court vets cases that come before it. And then the cases that they deem to be most important in terms of essentially advancing the jurisprudence around public international law of human rights would be adjudicated by the court. This would be a treaty-based organization where countries would sign on to it like they would sign on to any other treaty. And if they did sign on to the treaty, they would essentially adopt the decisions of a World Court of Human Rights as decisions of their domestic courts, and they could be enforceable as such.
Now, in addition to the three world courts that you mentioned, don't we have another example in Europe of a supranational court, and what's the experience with that court?
We do. I think you're referring to the European Court of Human Rights, which is, again, it's a regional court. It's basically, I think currently there are 43 countries that are members of the European Court of Human Rights, and it adjudicates human rights disputes that arise out of the footprint that are comprised of those 43 countries. I would call it a regional human rights court. There are also regional human rights bodies in Africa and in the Americas, but there is no regional human rights court in Asia. And so part of the task of creating a World Court of Human Rights, to sit on top of the existing 3 regional courts of human rights, would also be to essentially create an appellate body. so that if there was inconsistency between and among the three regional human rights courts, appeals could be taken to the World Court of Human Rights, and to the extent that there was a need for harmonization of the jurisprudence, that would occur there. We also feel very, very strongly, the designers of the treaty, that Asia really needs a regional court of human rights, currently does not have one. Asia, of course, is 60% of the world's population, probably 90% of the world's human rights violations. And so the absence of a regional court of human rights in Asia is a tremendous weakness of the current system. So I'm glad you reminded me of that, because so the goal of creating a World Court of Human Rights includes a goal of creating a regional court in Asia. But there's also a provision that to the extent that you are a victim of a human rights violation living in a place that does not have a regional court, such as in Asia, that you could apply directly to the World Court of Human Rights. But any kind of an organized system prefers to have a sequence of appeals, so that essentially there's a winnowing out of the cases that are heard. It's just a natural part of the court appellate process.
Now, that European Court of Human Rights, does it have a pretty good track record of actually effectively enforcing and succeeding in enforcing human rights law?
I would say it has the best human record or human enforcement record of any of the three regional courts. What basically happens when a country accedes to a treaty that includes a judicial body in it, that country basically accepts the notion that if there is a decision of the court, the regional human rights court, that affects that country, that the decision, the country having joined the treaty, the decision of that court is binding in the treaty joining country, just like a decision of a court in the domestic sphere. Is that mean there's automatic enforcement? No. Does it mean that there is a route for enforcement? Absolutely. And there is a huge difference, obviously, between theoretical access to justice and how the sort of rubber meets the road, if you will, how the practice is on the ground. And so enforcement is always a struggle, but as we have more and more countries signing on to these human rights treaties, we have a greater degree of a web, essentially, of enforceable law that begins to look a lot like world law, except we call it public international law because it is essentially by a compact or an agreement between and amongst nation states in the absence of a world government.
Right. Does the U.S. Constitution, in fact, state that treaties are part of the supreme law of our land?
Yes, but you also need to keep in mind that in order to be a part of a treaty, we in the United States, and this is pretty common around the world, it is the executive branch that enters into treaties. So our president would enter into a treaty, but then in order for it to become the law of the land, the treaty also has to be adopted by the legislative branch, in other words, by the United States Congress. So once those two things have taken place, a treaty, if the United States enters into a treaty like the Convention on the Law of the Sea, we are a member of that treaty. It was signed by the president, it was approved by the Congress, and to the extent that a decision is submitted to the International Court of Justice and a decision emanates, if a US party that is the subject of a decision, let's say an adverse decision, who doesn't want to abide by the ruling of the court, the plaintiff in the case can go to federal court here in the United States and force the defendant to abide by the ruling of that regional international court.
And have they been successful in doing that in terms of the Law of the Seas Treaty?
Absolutely. There was an example of a dispute between the United States and Canada about, at their borders, when you look out into the sea, what part of the sea do the US have rights to fish to the exclusion of the Canadians, and vice versa? And so US and Canada submitted that question essentially to the International Court of Justice. They made argument, a decision was forthcoming, and the parties abided by that decision.
Mm-hmm. That's good that there is an enforcement mechanism. We also see other examples, such as with Kellogg-Briand, where the U.S. is officially a party and others are, but totally seems to be lacking in our actually following the dictates of that treaty. the Kellogg-Briand, which outlawed, in fact, war and any kind of bombing around the world, and all the things that we're doing would be a violation of that treaty, and yet somehow the courts haven't enforced that.
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular dispute, but yes, enforceability is certainly a big issue. And if you were to look back, let's say to 1948, back when the UN first passed the Declaration of Human Rights, to the present, what you will see in that 80-year period or whatever is that you have many, many treaties that have been incubated as a result of the passage of the Declaration of Human Rights, and more countries signing on to them. So again, I think the analogy to a spider web is apt, because the treaties are essentially like a strand between two countries, or in the case of a multilateral treaty, strands that connect many countries. So for example, the Civil and Political Convention currently has, I think, 165 of the 195 countries in the world signed on to it. It is almost universally adopted, but clearly in the countries in which it is not adopted, a decision of, under that treaty would still have an impact. Some people refer to that as naming and shaming. The idea that you go to court, you get a decision, the court is, a particular country is ordered to take certain actions. If they refuse to do so in today's environment, where there is essentially instantaneous information worldwide, it comes to the attention of our 8 billion people that such and such country has refused to abide by a decision of the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, the World Court of Human Rights. And that can have an effect in the long term on the rights of the individuals who are parties to that case. Let me make one more quick comment. There's one of the Chief Justices that you've referred to from the Lucknow meetings is Karl Ashok Singh, who is the Chief Justice of Guyana. And he is noted for saying that just because something is not 100% enforceable doesn't mean it's worthless. And I think that, fighting the good fight and continuing to essentially educate the world and striving to have more and more complete accession to these important treaties, it's part of the struggle. We can't expect it to basically come to fruition instantaneously. But I also think when we look back 80 years, we can see that the trend is positive. More countries are signing on to more treaties. And I think the courts that are sort of embodied in those treaties are having a greater impact.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned naming and shaming, because that gets very close to what we're talking about when we talk about Gary's people-powered planet idea. And that is the idea that we can't just sit back and wait for governments to enforce things, governments to fix things up, that we, the people, are the power. We are the power that create government. We are the sovereigns. We give a bit of our sovereignty to governments and they act in our stead, but we can take that back and we can enforce it. And when you talk about naming and shaming, that basically means that, if we, the people, develop a way where we see this, like with landmines, for instance, the landmine treaty was passed, the US wouldn't sign on to it, but it was made against the law, and the companies that continue to make these landmines were named and shamed and didn't want to. Companies are very vulnerable to people withdrawing their support either for their investments, the whole divestment campaign, but even more in our power as consumers. And so one of the things that I hope as you're evolving the court that we might consider, or maybe we can talk about, is in addition to having the expectation that governments will enforce this, how can we actually build systematically into it ways that, for example, there's people-powered enforcement, that people withdraw their, well, take the nuclear ban right now. It says right in it that anyone that you're not supposed to support anyone who's involved in the manufacture, the development of it. Is there any way that you can see, for example, taking that nuclear treaty, that people could use the nuclear ban, that people could use the naming and shaming techniques for actually getting to enforce that, even in the nations which are not signatories to that treaty that has become world law, the banning of nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that the important thing that can be done at the grassroots level, the people-powered level, is number one, to try and spread the word about the need for these systems about their importance in terms of the protection of international human rights. I'm not a believer that we could create a World Court of Human Rights and have it be people powered. But I do think that people are indispensable in terms of convincing their nation states to join the treaty. And I think that the naming and shaming is something that takes place almost automatically as a result of the fact that communication is so universal, that we have opportunities such as this from folks from all over the world to get together to discuss the issues, to disseminate ideas. And so, the more countries that sign on to the more treaties that are protective of human rights, the better the situation will be. I would certainly much prefer to have 195 countries signed on as members of the treaty so that it would essentially be the domestic law of each and every country in the world. But as we wait to get to that point, as we strive to get to that point, in the meantime, the naming and shaming is just, I think it's just a question of people pulling out their iPhones and recording what they see and then posting it to the internet so that, the types of human rights violations that occur all too often in so many parts of the world are simply shown the light of day and not hidden. And so I think that's where the people powered part of this is so indispensable, is getting word out and getting support for the idea that this somewhat traditional style supranational court needs to be kicked off and needs to be operating in a fair and in a fair way, and its decisions enforced. If I may just say, the idea behind the Treaty of Lucknow, which is it is the proposed statute for the World Court of Human Rights, named the Treaty of Lucknow because this Chief Justice meeting occurs in Lucknow, and the Chief Justices were 100% unanimous in approving the concept in 2014, 14, because when I first went there in 2013 at Garry's request, it was to gauge the interest of the Chief Justices, and they were incredibly interested. They were totally committed to it. So in the year between 2013 and 14, I led a group of academics and international judicial specialists and judges to design the statute, brought it back to Lucknow, got their approval of the idea of the actual text. So where we are now is trying to get this treaty debated in front of the United Nations, as was the Landmine Treaty, because the way you create these supranational organizations is that you convince the critical number, the necessary minimum number of nation states to sign on to the treaty. And then you have the treaty becomes in force. Currently, the treaty calls for 10 countries to sign on, 10 of the 195, not a huge number. Obviously, once you meet that threshold, you have an operating court that starts. The more countries that join the treaty, which could be expected to happen over time, the more robust the system, the better funded, the more geographic scope that it covers, the greater its impact, the greater its public presence within the global judicial community. So that's kind of what I would envision as the direction.
We saw at the beginning of this podcast a little clip of Garry speaking to the Supreme Court justices from around the world in Lucknow. How many Supreme Court justices were there? What countries were represented? Many people don't know about that Lucknow conference, even though it's an extraordinary event to have Supreme Court justices from all over the world gathering to help create world law. Tell us a little bit more about that conference, who was there, and about how that happened.
So I believe that there were approximately half the world's countries represented at each of those years that I went there. So of the 195 countries, perhaps 80 or so countries were represented. Quite a few of those countries had their actual chief justices as the representative or as the lead of the delegation. Many of these countries, as you could see from the crowds in that video clip, these are heavily attended conferences, hundreds and hundreds of people. And many of the chief justices were there in person. I mentioned Chief Justice Singh from Guyana. He's a regular attendee. Chief Justice Odoki from Uganda. African chief justices were very well represented. South American chief justices very well represented. The Chief Justice of Afghanistan was there. Notably absent are many of the, let's call them, sort of more first world type countries. Was the United States represented? Not by a judge. It was represented by people indirectly, such as myself. There were a couple of delegations there, I think, as observers, and I'm not sure at whose behest those were. But so we had about half the world's countries represented, and if not the chief justices, then judges or academics who were very highly placed. And if I had to sort of, with a broad stroke, say that the countries that were represented there, the judiciaries, include many of the countries where some of the worst human rights violations take place. Now, of course, that's great that all those judges agree that we ought to sign on to the treaty. But keep in mind, it's the other two branches of government that are instrumental in adopting treaties. It's the executive branch in the first instance, and then the legislative branch confirms it. So you might ask yourself, why would the executive branch of a country that is engaged in human rights violations ever sign on to a treaty that could hold it accountable for its misdeeds? And that's one of the conundrums. But I would say to you, if that were a prohibition or a prohibitor of countries joining human rights treaties, then we wouldn't have members in these human rights treaties. And most of them have been acceded to or joined by most countries around the world. So,
well, in many cases, you think about any lawless place, the Wild West or other things where people are subject to lawless things, they realize that in order to have security, they've got to be top dog. They've got to be more violent than the others. But they actually would welcome a court above that would solve it. They actually, if they had that opportunity, and a perfect example of this is that when you know the story, or maybe you can tell us the story of Garry with Idi Amin and the British journalist who was you don't know the story. Well, in
Yep.
Garry's book, actually, maybe we'll bring David on even to tell that story because he's closer to it. And I see that David is waiting to ask a question, and several other people are waiting. So maybe we'll go to David, and I'll ask him first to tell that story because it's very instructive about how these nations that are human rights violators will actually follow it if they could get some instruction from a world court and a world body enforcing it. So I'll turn it back to Melanie. She'll introduce David, and maybe you can touch on that question and many others in talking with you about the whole court. Go ahead.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you so much, Mark. This is so informative and so inspiring. Yes, we had such a fabulous time in Lucknow at the Chief Justices of the World conference. It's very, very impressive. They do a phenomenal job. There's 30,000 students at the school, and I don't know how they do it. It's an incredible, incredible event. So thank you for being here. Yes, let's go to David now. David is the president of the World Service Authority, the World Citizen Government arm. So David, we're very excited to have you here as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Melanie and Arthur, and Mark. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to be working with Mark over the last almost 10 years on the World Court of Human Rights. Mark is the head of the World Court of Human Rights design team, and we're hoping to have some new design team meetings perhaps over the next 6 months and get some input on the statute. But just, Arthur, to go back to the question about Idi Amin, yes, there was a British journalist who was reporting about the Idi Amin regime, of course, exposing rights violations, and then he got detained. That was when Louis Kuttner, who helped to draft the first version of the World Court of Human Rights statute with Garry, jumped into action and issued a world habeas corpus order against the Idi Amin government, saying you must immediately release this British journalist. If not, as Mark has aptly said, there will be a naming and shaming going on. And it just so happened within, I think it was a day, maybe it was 2 days, that this British journalist was released after this, at that point, it was, I think, just a telegram or a telex that was sent to the Idi Amin regime government with this world habeas corpus, meaning let him free, release him from detention unless you have a valid legal case against him, which they didn't. So there's the power of just having even a draft statute for a World Court of Human Rights. There's a power to that. So, and this, of course, is Garry's whole life of taking action and bold action to make change for either an individual or for the whole planet. But so what I want to do, and the reason why I wanted to ask a question is because this is something that I'm dealing with another lawyer, and that is this is more of a philosophical question, Mark, and that is, are human rights innate, meaning we are born with them simply by being human beings, or are they just social constructs? I mean, Garry always used to say to me, David, human rights are not grants by states, because if governments can grant rights, they can also deny them. And I guess I asked this question about the innateness, you might say, of rights, because where do we get the validity for our for the international courts, the regional courts, and our future World Court of Human Rights, if these human rights principles, aren't innate, I might say.
So fascinating question, and something that actually I was thinking about the other day in the following context. We've mentioned that there are regional courts of human rights, the one in Europe, one in Africa, one in the Americas. They each have their own treaties, if you will, of human rights. So if human rights law or human rights generally are innate and sort of across the board, why would you have regional human rights? And, is there a tip of the hat to cultural issues, for example? And so I think, so for example, some would argue that, for example, in Africa, the cultural background is just different, the context is different, and so that there needs to be a slightly different, maybe more than slightly different, set of rules of engagement, if you will. My personal feeling is that if you boil down the human rights to the most basic human rights, then there really is no difference. If it's a question of access to nutrition, access to clean water, access to healthcare, freedom from slavery, freedom from physical violence, I think those are indeed universal human rights principles. When you start drifting away from that and you start getting into questions about, sexual mutilation and stuff like that, and there are countries that argue essentially, well, that's just part of our culture. And so is a World Court of Human Rights going to tolerate, let's say, sexual mutilation because it happens to be the practice in certain cultures? I would say probably not, but I'm also fond of saying that I am content agnostic when it comes to the actual cases that we would anticipate coming before these courts, or how the cases are going to rule. I am sort of a systems guy. And so you could certainly have a situation where the African Human Rights Regional Court would adjudicate a dispute arising in Africa under a African Human Rights Treaty. And the outcome of that may be very different, or maybe somewhat different, than a similar proceeding in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I think when and again, the more broadly you think about human rights, the more regionalization I think is susceptible to. I basically think that to keep things simple and also keep it effective. I mean, this World Court of Human Rights, we're talking about dealing with large scale problems, like 6 million Syrian refugees, or 100,000 internally displaced people in the Central African Republic, or the Rohingya as a group. And I think when you start thinking about their right to nutrition, hydration, healthcare, freedom from personal liberty, freedom from enslavement, I think that those are intrinsic and they are universal. And so I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's how I would attempt to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this could be a very long debate. We could spend hours just talking about, whether rights are innate or inalienable. But I do like how Mark is getting to the point that some of our basic needs, which could then be linked to basic rights, must be fulfilled. I mean, if we die, then we don't have any rights, right? So having nutrition, having water or healthcare, or being free from enslavement are crucial, obviously. So yeah, thank you for that, Mark.
And one of the areas, David, that you were mentioning is that the design team may be reconvening over the next few months. And one of the things that's on our agenda to talk about is whether and to what extent global warming is a human rights implicating issue, and whether should the idea of the court should it become a world court of human and environmental rights? And I was recently on a podcast listening to Jonathan Granoff from the Global Security Institute talking with, I can't remember her name now, but the famous gorilla researcher. And they were talking about, well, animals have rights too. And so, well, what about a world court of human, environmental and animal rights? And my feeling is that as a process person, I think as long as you have this final authority at the top of this regional scheme, I wouldn't go designing a different name, or I wouldn't go trying to anticipate how a court might rule in particular circumstances, because again, the law as it evolves in this area is really the growing body of public international law that evolves through the more and more nation states signing on to more and more treaties that are in some way or other human rights related. And so I would stay out of the trying to anticipate or trying to engineer or drive or steer the direction of the court, and make it more of what the Latin phrase is tabula rasa, a blank slate on which the facts are written, and then the judges apply the law to those facts as found.
I think the environment should be included. That's my vote. And Diane Fossey, I think that's who you're thinking of.
I think that's correct.
Yes. So now that was excellent. So now let's go to our second question. We have Barbara. Barbara, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mark. First, I just want to tell you what a complete overview of what's going on today. I really appreciate your succinct way of telling us. My husband was an intern at the United Nations after the Bill of Human Rights was signed. And he stood in the hall as an intern, and the media said, well, there's another piece of paper to throw in the trash. And my husband said, mark my words, this will be the most translated document on the planet. And it is, next to the Bible. My husband was Robert Mueller, who created many, many of the programs at the United Nations. And I'm lucky that I had his tutoring for all these years. And now I'm doing these podcasts. And recently I interviewed Ben Ferenz. Are you familiar with Ben Ferenz in the International Criminal Court?
Absolutely. 102 years old, last surviving prosecutor from Nuremberg.
These stories that you know and the stories that you tell us are so valuable because people remember stories. And Ben Ferenz was only 28 when this took place. And they said, we can't do it. There's too many people here. We have to try. And he said, nope, we have 30 chairs. I'll go through them all and I'll pick the 30 worst criminals. So that's kind of what you're facing. You are the Ben Ferenz of now. There are so many atrocities on the planet. And if we can help you any way we can, we would love to. So what's our first step? That's my question. Where do we begin in this process of identifying the most horrible human rights, of prosecuting them in a way that makes it a case that we can't do that anymore?
So the Ben Ferenz piece, I think, is really timely. He has been in the news quite a bit lately. He's still doing well. I know David has been in touch with him just recently. I think that, boy, how to approach this question. There is quite an inventory of human rights violations that already exist. People like Human Rights Watch and Democracy Now! And Amnesty International. If you can look, for example, on the World Court of Human Rights.net website to see sort of the map. And it's sort of a visual representation of what is the extent of human rights violations in particular geographic parts of the world. And you'll see that, for example, Asia is very red. The United States is less so. Western Europe is less so. I'm not sure that identifying the large-scale human rights violations is going to be the hard part. Because again, this court that we have envisioned, the statute anticipates a screening process, just like the US Supreme Court screens cases. You may know that the US Supreme Court gets about 10,000 petitions a year for it to hear cases. They typically limit themselves to something like 75. And they take the ones that are most, in their view, most likely to have a broad impact, most likely to be important in terms of growing the unity of the jurisprudence globally around such things or nationally around such things. So I think there's plenty of human rights violations deal with. Boko Haram is just another example that's sometimes used. And again, it's a question of what are the largest scale violations, because the court's going to want to attend to those areas where it's going to have an impact on the largest number of people. These are real-time human rights situations. I think the most important thing then where we're headed right now is we have to get debate of this treaty in front of the UN, because that's where you incubate treaties. That's where the landmine treaty was incubated. Jody Williams, who's a fellow Vermonter, with whom we've also been in regular touch. She was the one who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995 for the landmine treaty. And what they did was they went to the United Nations and they got a handful of nation states to agree that this is something worth debating. The debate took place. The treaty was fine-tuned through that debate, just like a legislative package that gets introduced in the United States Congress, or a state legislative branch, or the legislative body of another country. The more sponsors, and for a treaty, that would be nation states, the more influential the sponsors. If we could get the United States and India and folks like that to basically get behind this, the more likelihood it has that the necessary number of countries will sign on. And once you've got the necessary critical mass, then I think that the system takes on sort of a life of its own. So I think that, and we're talking about now sort of pairing up the world chief justices with the Nobel Peace Laureates, and then going to the United Nations and actually making a pitch directly to the United Nations saying, we need this treaty to be debated. But I also think that in the meantime, we need a handful of nation states to say we're behind it. Now, are they going to be nation states where there's less in the way of human rights to be worried about? Probably. If Denmark helps us out, how much good is that going to do? There's no human rights violations in Denmark that I'm aware of. I didn't think there were any in Canada until I gave a speech like this in Ottawa, and I was told that the Canadians, with all due respect, can be criticized for their oil and extractive industries around the world, and how those things implicate pollution, erosion, and all sorts of other problems. So my plea to all of you, this widespread group that's listening, is, to the extent that you can get your nation state government to sign on to this as being a good goal, be in touch with us, be in touch with David Gallup. And because we're really trying to sign up nation states to go with us to the United Nations. There's some talk of me traveling back to Lucknow this coming fall. I don't think that there's going to be much purpose in doing that unless I can first convince one or more members of the Nobel Peace Laureates to join me, to go over there to try and make common cause. Because you can imagine that if, on the nightly news or the BBC or the Voice of America or whatever, if word comes that a group of world chief justices and peace laureates and a handful of countries have all come to the United Nations, urging it to give serious consideration to this step that actually first emerged in 1947 at the UN. The amazing historical piece is that the year before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948, the year before that, the Australian delegation suggested, hey, we should really have a World Court of Human Rights. And there's one of the people that spoke in my panel in Ottawa brought this up, and he is the head of the Human Rights Center at McGill University in Montreal. And he actually had researched some of the underlying documents from 1947 from the United Nations. The ironic and somewhat humorous part about that was the response at that time in 1947 was, you're getting ahead of yourself. Let's first have a Declaration of Human Rights, and then let's incubate some treaties. So we then have a body of law under which a World Court of Human Rights would then adjudicate fact patterns. So I think that's what, if there's one thing that it could be produced from this conversation today, it would be an energy and, one or more nation states contacting us, the design team or whatever, and saying, yeah, we're with you. Where do we sign up? And the answer would probably be come to Lucknow in October of 2022. And I think that's the direction that this is heading. And I will say that the guy who curates the Nobel Peace Laureates, who is Jonathan Granoff of the Global Security Institute, is very supportive of this entire concept in principle. It's just that the Nobel laureates that he sort of shepherds as part of his job, they have their own issues, they have their own busyness. They're, of course, rock stars around the world. There's also an organization that's just reached out to me called Cinema for Peace, and I commend it to you. It's a Berlin-based organization, Cinema for Peace, and they are an organization that does filmmaking in furtherance of human rights. And so they are about to do a project, sort of like a series of documentaries, wherein they might actually put together on TV their own sort of homemade human rights adjudicative body, and basically put under a microscope the behavior of certain nation states, whether it be Putin today or Yemen or places like that. And so in essentially, some people have referred to this as Judge Judy meets the ICC. And so they have reached out to me, and guess why? Because they said to me, we found you through your work with the World Court of Human Rights. And so we're beginning to actually seemingly get noticed around the world. And that's what we need. And I would suggest to you that this level of notification or this level of awareness about our effort is something that is going to take off and grow exponentially. And I'm beginning to sense traction. And so this is what I would urge us all to do. Get the word out, get word back to us. Let's get some nation states excited about this. And I think we're on the brink. I would say that the academics who have looked over the little blue book that David held up, which I happen to have right, I never have it far away. They have said that this Treaty of Lucknow is remarkably well written. I mean, it's a really, as far as, oh, there we go. I mean, it's a product of a lot of hard work from a lot of really relevant and knowledgeable people. And so, but I have no pride of authorship. When this thing hits the cutting room floor, if you will, at the United Nations, and they say, well, we got to change the 15 justices to 11, and we have to, change the contentious jurisdiction a little bit and so on. That's fine. This is a draft.
What is that document you're holding?
It's called, this is actually the little booklet.
Oh.
Yeah, David has them. This is, don't get a version number 1, get the version number 2. David and World Service Authority was actually very kind to create these so I could hand them out in India, which I did. And I also hand them out wherever I go locally. But yeah, spread the word, and let's all plan to meet in New York City and get this conversation going.
Mark, we love your passion. This is incredible. It's so inspiring, and people, it just seems like there's a gathering of people going towards a beautiful world. So yes, thank you for all that information. And it was so interesting about Australia. Wow. So way back when, 47, that's incredible. So yes, we have time for one more question, and tell me if I mispronounce your name. Namrata, do I say it right?
That's fine, yeah, Namrata, yeah, fine,
Namrata.
Perfect, Melanie. Yes, please. Thank you, people. I'm suddenly feeling like I've reached the right space, and all my years in Rotary have been worth it, because Mark, that's an outstanding goal that we are after. And let me say one thing, that the Lucknow treaty that you speak of got no traction in India. It was not publicized in India. Nobody read about it. Nobody heard about it. I'm saying that because there's more needs to be done there, where probably I can be of some help. However, the reason I want to speak right now is about the human rights violations under the current regime are awful. They are so bad, it would put the Nazis to shame. I'm not a political activist. I have never been, and I have no political ambition whatsoever of this sort. And this is a commentary on the times we are living in. I live in New Delhi, India, very close to where this stuff happens. And it is absolutely distressing. I must tell you, there are students under attack for any kind of university level protest that they come up with. They are under attack, they are put in jail, and they don't come to trials for years. Most of the students in our country are very poor, their families are poor, they cannot take any recourse, legal recourse whatsoever, even locally, much as it is available. I mean, law is good in India, but it has to be appealed to, and nobody has the resources. NGOs have little money. NGO activists, Christian activists, priests, comedians, even people whoever had even the gumption to stand and make a political statement, however comic, they are under bar. Journalists are behind bars. And the situation with Muslims, and they're like 30 million plus Muslims in India. Maybe I'm getting my figures wrong. And India before Modi had a very different culture. I'm sorry to use his name. He's my prime minister, and I would defend him any which ways as my prime minister. But if I look at the policies, they are horrific. They are horrifying. And if this, through this platform, if we can even look at communal hatred that is being spread, the kind of, legal issues that are there, if some help, I don't know what we can do and how we can start to do. But anybody that's, I mean, Amnesty International's wings have been chopped. Nobody is allowed. Oh, Kashmir, we don't even wish to start there, because Kashmir is a totally different kettle. I mean, it's a cauldron or whatever you want to call it. It's a ticking time bomb actually. But Kashmir is not the purview of this entire conversation. But the human rights violations in Kashmir are offensive to a little child even. They would tell you. So things on the street are very bad in India. If we can do something, I mean, if we can just shortlist, pick up one problem here, it would have a similar effect in Pakistan, because Pakistan's situation is not, I mean, at the moment, probably not as bad, because they've been under military regime forever. So human rights violations are a norm there. In India, that was not the norm. So I just wanted to alert you guys to it. I'm so glad. But I mean, if you would like me to contact a local university and send you data, send you material, would love to do that, because I think that's the need of the hour. If we educated, people, with your help, you guys are such a wonderful group. I'm amazed. I mean, I'm so glad that I'm here. Arthur, thank you so much. You sent me that link. Thank you so much.
So I really appreciate your words. And if I can just respond, I know we're almost out of time. Back when I was going to India those 3 years in a row, when I was thinking about sponsors, you remember I said the more influential the country, the more numerous the countries that would be interested in bringing this to the UN, the more powerful our effort. I sort of naively thought about, well, what about the United States and India? Probably because I'm from the United States and I was meeting in India. We also had President Obama at that time. And Modi was already in office. And I remember I made a recommendation to the hosts in Lucknow that the home minister be invited in the subsequent year as a chief guest of a particular day. And so sure enough, the next year, Rajiv Singh, who was then the home minister, was invited. I actually put together a package of information for him, walked right up to him. I thought the security people would probably grab me, but they didn't. I just walked up to him. I said, "Sir, let me introduce myself." And I gave him a packet and he promised to share it. Now I've realized in retrospect that thinking that the US or India would be lead sponsors might have been naive. But I also want to point out that there are provisions in the statute for what we call public interest standing, because you're right, a normal rank and file person that's a victim of human rights, how are they going to represent themselves? Or they're going to hire counsel? But there's a provision here that public standing would be possible. So Human Rights Watch could say, this is an important thing. They could devote money to, let's say, hiring a legal team to advance a petition to a World Court of Human Rights. And the World Court of Human Rights, as envisioned in the statute, also would have an ombudsman, who is an independent, free person within the organization that could look at a petition filed, let's say, on behalf of unrepresented people and say, if the court feels that this is a case worth taking, we will actually staff the legal representation from within the court. But again, it's a disconnected independent branch. So I do understand that giving voice to people that normally would not be expected to have voice is an important piece and something that we have contemplated here. So it's 2:01, and so I will stop talking.
Mark, you're amazing. This has been fascinating. This is so interesting. There's so much to it, and a lot of comments in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Mark. And now I'll send it back to Arthur. Arthur, take it away.
Mark, this was extraordinary. Thank you so much. Next week's speaker is Al Jubitz, and he's on the National Advisory Board of the Environmental Defense Fund, the Leadership Council at the Yale School of Forestry. He's a past president of the Rotary Club of Portland. He's one of the sponsors of our film, The World Is My Country. And he's just a soft-spoken, incredible guy who's really a mover and shaker. He's the executive producer of a bold piece about how Costa Rica, when they were surrounded by hostile military powers threatening them, got rid of their army. And then nobody could attack them. And for 75 years, they've been secure. They have almost 100% renewable energy. They're one of the highest country, the top highest countries in happiness index. They have everyone has education in school just by getting rid of their military. So it's an extraordinary film, a bold piece. I do want to actually read you a little excerpt from Garry's book, World Government Ready or Not. Garry wrote 10 different books, maybe 11, depending on how you count them. And all of them are extraordinary. And we want to start our series, which we will talk about. We talked about it before, but Martin Sheen's proposing a series on Garry's book, My Country is the World. But if it's a success, we'll go on to the other stories. But anyway, so here's Idi Amin. Seizes this journalist, and the whole world is in an uproar about it. And Amnesty International is writing letters, and everybody's complaining, and nobody can budge Idi Amin. This guy called me a bully, a childhood bully. I'm not going to let him get away with it. So Louis Kuttner, who Garry had appointed president, chief justice of the World Court of Human Rights. He actually did that in France years before. He started this World Court of Human Rights. Now we're going to get it to the global level. Anyway, he issued this edict, a writ of habeas corpus, and Idi Amin responded, offering to negotiate Dennis Hill's release. And so Louis Kuttner replied, please, he had a phone call with the president's legal advisor, and he responded, he said, please inform His Excellency that this is not a diplomatic matter. It is strictly judicial. Therefore, there is no question of negotiation. If the defendant is not released forthwith, this court will issue a show cause order to which the president will have 30 days to reply. And what happened is that there was a short silence. Then the legal advisor said, allow me to thank the Chief Justice for his further elucidation. I shall immediately transmit this to His Excellency, the President. As soon as I've received further instruction, I'll inform Your Honor. They had 2 further phone calls, and at 5 p.m. Uganda time, Cecil Hill was released from detention. So it took the force, Garry had the gumption, and his court had the gumption to just do it. And we, the people, have that power. So let's see if Mark has any last word before we thank everyone for being a part of this extraordinary discussion. Let's do it, folks. It's up to us. Governments aren't going to do it. We have to do it. But go ahead, Mark. What's your last word?
Well, just to finish on that idea, where do courts get their power? Where do they get their authority? And that it comes from the rank and file of our society, respecting the process and agreeing to be bound by the decision of a court that they believe in and that they believe is valid and not corrupt, and so on. And what a wonderful sort of story of the Amin government essentially sensing that this was a court that had credibility, and in the face of that, they said, okay, fine. And so, this is their obligation to follow the dictates of a court that really didn't even exist. Were next to zero, but there was an individual who was being detained for the wrong reasons, who was released on the strength of the notion that there are higher principles that need to be obeyed. And again, I'm an optimist to the point of naivete. But I find that that's an important posture to take. I've been disappointed at times in my life, but I've soldiered on. And so I think as long as we can continue to publicize the idea of a court that is going to be honest, that is going to be transparent, that is going to be accessible to the people who really need it, I think that we are offering something that everybody would agree is valuable, and therefore the decisions of which should be followed. So to the extent that I can continue to work with you and with all the other stakeholders interested in this, we're very excited to do so, and I thank you for having me on today.
So how can people contact you? How can they sign up to work with this? What's the best way for people to follow up?
If you go to the worldcourtofhumanrights.net website and you look, browse around, take a look at the statute, take a look at some of the video from Lucknow. There's also a comment functionality. You can put a comment there, and I receive that comment, and I get some interesting input from folks around the world. Some of it is very thoughtful, some of it is less thoughtful, but that anything that if you go to that website and you make a comment, it'll come directly to me and I will respond.
Suri pointed out so powerfully the terrible human rights violations, and these things are magnified around the world. So you're doing crucial work for all of us, and this is really essential work to carry on. So thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you, everyone. Come back each week where we'll either have speakers or we'll have our socials and our working group. In this case, we're having Al Jubitz, an extraordinary speaker, next week. So we will see you next week at the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.